This is chapter 9, and we'll be covering lifespan development. First thing is figuring out how we're going to study development in the first place throughout the lifespan. So within these two chapters, because chapters 9 and 10 will be covering lifespan development, more or less we want to know why do we need to know about how one develops in the first place. Understand that this is the study of age-related changes within one's behavior. That includes our mental processes that starts from the time we are conceived to the time when we pass on and transcend. We'll study the changes that's in our physical and cognitive development from conception through death. So in chapter 10, which was the next chapter, we'll be examining and looking at the social, moral, and personal development changes over the lifespan. But here in chapter 9, we're going to look at those physical and cognitive development facets. So in terms of developmental psychology, it studies how we grow as well as how we change throughout 8 major stages of life. That being the prenatal stages, which is the time we're conceived into the time we're born, infancy, and infancy counts between the ages of birth to approximately 18 months. Then we go into early childhood and going into becoming a toddler and a young, ambitious, curious child. And that's from 18 months to 6 years. Middle childhood is spanning from 6 to 12 years. Adolescence is considered between approximately 12 years and 20 years. Then we're becoming young adults, which the majority of you are in, and that's from the ages of 20 to 45 years old. Then you move into my territory, which is middle adulthood, and that's between the ages of 45 to 60 years. And after that, it's considered to be late adulthood. So now, there are a lot of theoretical issues and different controversies that goes on when we're talking about and speaking of development. One of them would be nature versus nurture. So the issue of nature versus nurture has kind of been with us since the beginning of when psychology first got started. And those who believe in nature find that human behavior and development are basically governed by automatic and genetically predetermined signals, signs, and it's within a process that's known as maturation. So think of a flower that unfolds in accord with its genetic blueprint. We as humans, we would crawl before we would walk, and then we would walk before we would run. Additionally, there's going to be optimal periods that's shortly after birth, one of several different critical periods that will be happening throughout our lifetime. And when an organism is particularly sensitive to certain experiences, that helps to shape our capacity for future development. On the other side of the coin would be those who hold that there's an extreme nurturist position that would argue that our development really happens from our learning personal experience as well as observing others. So part of this process would have the debate about stages or whether continuity plays a hand. That's that second issue that is whether development would occur in discrete qualitative type stages, or is it something that's going to be continuous, something that's quantitative or measurable through gradual shifts. Now, those who believe in stages, stage theorists, they kind of feel that development would occur at different rates, which would alternate between different periods of a little bit of change, and then there'll be a periods of rapid, abrupt change. As we get further into the chapter, we'll be able to talk about the stages more specifically, particularly within physical development. We'll look at Piaget's stage theory of cognitive development. Anyway, getting back to this slide, continuity theorists, they kind of feel that we pretty much maintain development as a continual that our new abilities, our skills, and knowledge kind of comes to us gradually and relatively in a uniform type pace. So what they're saying is, like, for example, adult thinking and intelligence differ quantitatively from a child's. Now, have you generally maintained your personal characteristics since being an infant into adulthood? Has there been stability for you? Or do you feel that your current personality really has nothing to do or has very little resemblance to your personality that you had as an infant? Psychologists who kind of emphasize on stability and development would say that the measurements of personality that's taken during childhood are important predictors of how you will be as an adult with your personality. So, of course, psychologists who emphasize change is going to disagree. Understand with stability or change, stability meaning your childhood personality measurements will be closely able to predict your adult personality. And that change would say that experiences of your life change would develop from childhood into adulthood, and more or less is going to kind of demonstrate differences because of those experiences. Now, interactionist perspective versus biopsychosocial models. Which of these positions would be more correct? Most psychologists, they're going to kind of say it's hard to say either way. Rather, they'll prefer to look at it the interactionist perspective as well as the biopsychosocial model. So one example would be when we're talking about nature versus nurture, psychologists kind of agree that development emerges from unique genetic predispositions as well as from experiences. Okay? Those experiences as well as our genetics kind of make who we are. When we're speaking about research approaches within developmental psychology, we're looking at how study changes that happen through the entire human lifespan. So developmental psychologists, they'll kind of add two specific techniques to be able to approach this. That being cross-sectional designs as well as longitudinal designs. So now the cross-sectional design pretty much explores individuals within various stages, like being 5, 10, 15, or 20 years. Okay? And then at one point in time, it'll give information about age difference. Whereas with the longitudinal design, now this is going to follow more of a single individual or a group of same age people over an extended period of time, and that'll give information about age changes. So looking at this slide, we're going to compare the methods. Why do these two research methods show different results? Well, the answer to this question pretty much is talking about how cross-sectional studies would sometimes be confused with genuine age differences with cohort effects. Cohort effects are talking about those differences that would result from specific histories of an age group that's been studied. When you look at the graphic here, it's showing you at the top line in the figure that 81-year-olds measured by the cross-sectional design had a dramatically lower scores than those who were 25 years old. Now, this is kind of due to aging or possibly to the broad environmental differences between each group, such as one may have had less formal education, one's nutrition might have been poor. There's different variables that may exist. But because the different age groups are called cohorts, they grew up in different historical periods. Okay? So these results, they might not apply to people growing up at different times. With the cross-sectional design, age effects and cohort effects are going to sometimes get all tangled up, okay, and not always in a great way. So why do the two methods show different type of results? Researchers have suggested that the different results kind of reflect a central problem with cross-sectional studies. That being, these studies are often going to be confused with genuine age differences with those cohort effects. And the differences results from specific histories of the age group that's been studied, like we've seen in the figure, okay? So in this figure again, we have 81-year-olds that were measured by a cross-sectional method, and they have dramatic lower scores than those who were 25-year-olds. But again, this can be due to the age or possibly different environmental influences, such like this is less formal education, or one group might have experienced the poor nutrition. So because of the different age groups, which again are called cohorts, they grew up in different historical periods. So the results will not be the same, okay? Now, this is just a slide that's kind of giving you the advantages and disadvantages between cross-sectional groups and longitudinal groups. So with cross-sectional groups, some of the advantages is that it's going to help give us information at different age stages. Okay, it'll help. It's quick and less expensive to be able to conduct such studies, and you generally can have a large type of sample. Whereas with longitudinal, the advantage is going to be that it's going to give you information about those age changes. It'll help increase the confidence levels within the results. And then there's going to be a more in-depth of information per participant. Disadvantages for cross-sectional, we have those cohort effects that I just spoke about. So it's hard to separate when you might be talking about a group who are 81-year-olds in comparison to a group who are 25-year-olds. There is some restriction of generalizability because measures in the behavior is at one point in time, and if there are generation differences, again, that's not going to give you the accurate information you were hoping for. Again, remember, it gets tangled up. Disadvantages for longitudinal studies, the main one is expensive. Imagine that you wanted to do a study about twins from birth until adulthood. That's a lot of years. Let's say 21 years. So that can be very expensive as well as time consuming. It's restricted as well with generalizability because you're really using a smaller sample. It can be 1 to 2 people that you're studying, and it would really be hard for us to say that that's how everyone would be. And you have to worry about people deciding they don't want to be bothered anymore. That's also a issue that can come up. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about physical development. So let's start with the prenatal. Here we're going to start talking about conception and talking about the zygote, fallopian tubes, everything that you see on this slide. After discharge from either the left or right ovary, which, just if you didn't know, here's your ovary right here. Okay. The ovum will travel to the opening of the fallopian tube. Here's your fallopian tube. They will travel along this route. Let's see if I can get it to draw. There we go. They travel along that route. Okay. If fertilization occurs, and it normally would take place within the first third of the fallopian tube. So as you see these little dots right here, it's kind of giving you an indication, gives you an indication of where. So 2, 3, 4. So the first third, right around here, we'll start seeing things happening. And then here, hopefully, is where that fertilizer will go to sit, which we now are going to call the zygote. When the zygote reaches that uterus, it's going to implant itself within the wall of the uterus, and that's when growth starts to occur. It starts out with tendril-like structures that kind of intertwine with the rich supply of blood vessels that's located within the uterus. So once implantation occurs, the organism will now change from a zygote into an embryo. Okay. I'm sorry. Moving on. So with prenatal growth, as well as growth during the first few years after birth, is proximal distal, and that's considered to be near to far, with the innermost parts of the body developing before the outermost parts. So a fetus' arms will develop before its hands and fingers. Development also proceeds cephalocaudally, which is from head to tail. Thus, a fetus head is going to be much larger compared to the lower part of its body. Now, when we're speaking about the major hazards, there's what we're calling critical period that is occurring during the first 3 months. Okay. During pregnancy, the placenta, which would be the vascular organ that helps to unite the fetus to the mother's uterus, it serves as the link for nourishment for the embryo and the fetus. That's where the food would go, and it's going to also be where waste go. It also screens out some, but not all, harmful substances. Now, there's going to be environmental hazards like X-rays or toxic waste or drugs or diseases like the measles, German measles, that can actually cross over through the placental barrier. These influences generally will have their most devastating effects during those first 3 months of pregnancy, making this a critical period within development. Even more importantly, and it can be generally avoidable, are dangers to the fetus that might come from drugs, both legal as well as illegal. If a mother to be smokes or drinks, these are called major teratogens, and these are those environmental agents that can cause major damage during prenatal development. Mothers who smoke tobacco, drink alcohol during pregnancy, they'll have a significantly higher rate of premature births, low birth weight infants, or even worse, fetal deaths. Their children will also show increased behavior and cognitive problems as they get older. Now, when they talk about alcohol, this also readily crosses that placenta, and this affects fetal development, which can result in a neurotoxic type of syndrome called fetal alcohol syndrome. Here, prenatal exposure to alcohol can cause facial abnormalities as well as stomach growth. But the most disabling feature of fetal alcohol syndrome is going to be that neurobehavioral problems. And this can range from hyperactivity or learning disabilities to intellectually challenged, to depression, and even psychosis. So just remember, in terms of wanting to understand and kind of wanting to recall and remember for test time, I want you to make sure you remember what teratogens are. These is alcohol and nicotine can be considered teratogens, and these are those environmental agents that can cross through the placenta barrier, causing damage during the development of prenatal development. Fetal alcohol syndrome is a specific syndrome that's a combination of birth defects from alcohol abuse. All right. So do y'all remember when we were working in chapter 2? I know it feels so long ago. But we talked about how the human brain is divided into three major sections. Okay, that being the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. Now, I want you to just recall that looking at the slide here, that after 3 weeks from conception, these three brain sections are one long neural tube, okay, that'll later become the brain and the spinal cord. So, as infants learn and develop, their synaptic connections between the active neurons, they'll start to strengthen. And the dendrites connections are going to become more elaborate and more distinct. Synaptic pruning, which is the reduction of unused synapses, will help support the process. Myelination is that accumulation of fatty tissue that's coating the axons of the nerve cells, and it'll continue all the way up into early adulthood. Now, there are dramatic changes within our brain as well as in our body, speaking specifically about our proportions. So as we grow older, at birth, it's like your head is about a fourth of your total body size. Whereas in adulthood, your head will become about 1/8 your body size. So you could take a look, and as you can see, at 2 months old, your head is just about the same size as the rest of your body, unless you are freakishly long. My oldest son, he did have a large head, but he also had a really long body because he came out to be 2 feet long, really. But anyway, moving on. When we look at the early childhood development physically, we'll start talking about motor development. Compared to the hidden internal changes within our brain development, there's an orderly emergence of active movement skills. And this is going to be known as that motor development. That's something that we're easily able to observe and be able to measure if we're doing any kind of quantifiable type of studies. So, talking about a newborn, the first motor activities is going to be quite limited, and it's going to be limited just to the reflexes or those involuntary responses to stimulation. So an example being is the rooting reflex. This happens when the baby's teeth, like say for example, your new mom, you just had the baby, and you want to breastfeed. Well, the technique that's been taught is generally to have the breast nipple slide across the baby's face, and the baby will automatically go to the nipple, okay? It's an automatic reflex. The baby will turn their head, open their mouth, and they're going to try to root for that nipple. Additionally, there's going to be some simple reflexes that the infant will start showing voluntary control over in terms of movement of various body parts. And you can look at the slide, it kind of gives you some ideas. So usually approximately 2.2 months, which I've seen infants as early as 2-3 days be able to lift up their head almost to where their chin is all the way up. But that's on an individual basis. For the most part, on average, it would be 2.2 months. At 2.8 months, the infant will begin to be able to roll over. Around 3 months of age, they start to sit up with support. And then when they're close to 6 months, they'll start sitting alone by themselves. Again, close to the 6-month mark, they'll also be able to start standing while holding furniture. Approximately 9 months, that's when they be able to start walking. In between that, they didn't demonstrate on the slide, but they'll start crawling first, and that's going to be in between that 5 to 6 month mark that they'll start to crawl. Standing alone is when they're almost near the 12th month. and walking along, hopefully. And again, I want to reiterate that it's not necessarily going to be all children at this, but these are the approximations. Uh, Usually close to 18 months is when a child or a toddler will be able to start walking up steps. They'll be able to have more motor coordination and be able to do it easier. All right, so continuing and speaking about physical development in early childhood. At birth, a newborn, they're able to smell most odors, most of them. And they can usually distinguish between things that are sweet or salty or might have bitter taste. Okay? Uh, Newborns that have been breastfed, they are also able to recognize and show a preference for odor as well as taste of their mother's milk over another mother's. They are able to tell. Okay? Um, Additionally, newborn sense of touch and pain is really highly developed, and that's usually been seen and demonstrated through reactions to heel pricks. If you haven't never had a child, usually the pediatrician tests their reaction times would prick at the heel of their foot uh, when they're doing blood testing, and yes, an infant can tell you that they're in pain. They know it, they feel it, as well as with male infants, circumcision. Okay. Newborn sense of vision, however, is what's going to be still really far along in terms of development. At birth, infants estimated to have a vision of 20 by 200 through maybe 20 to 600, very poor. So what you can think of is how the infant's visual life might be like and the level of detail that they see at 200 or 600 feet. If you have 20/20 vision in comparison, so what they see at 20 feet within the first few months is a blur, it's bad. However, good news is as time goes on, after a few months, the vision is going to start quickly improving. And usually, approximately at 6 months, that 20 to 200 will change to 20 to 100 or even better than that. And around 2 years old, that's when visual acuity will reach almost adult levels of 20/20. Now, one of the more interesting things that's been discovered within infant sensory as well as perceptual research is about the auditory, the hearing. Not only can a newborn hear quite well at birth, but also during the last few months in the womb, a fetus actually apparently hears sounds outside the mother's body. So you might hear it's like some mothers as they was expecting, might have started reading books to their child while they were in the room. I myself played music for my children, which now they're all stuck on Motown, even as adults. But it's because of the presence of being able to hear even while they were in the room during the last trimester. So this helps raise an interesting possibility about fetal learning, and whereas we can advocate for those type of special stimulations for the fetus that would hopefully increase the level of intelligence, creativity, as well as general alertness. Now, there have been studies on possible fetal learning that have found that newborn infants easily are able to recognize their mother's voice over their strangers. They also been able to show a preference for children's stories. Like I told you, some people would read to the fetus. So they might have an interest if it was the Cat in the Hat or the King and the Mouse. Uh, these are things that's usually been read to them while they were still in the womb. They'll recognize and recall that story. Now, on the other hand, though, there are some experts that have said caution to providing that type of stimulation. They're saying that too much of the wrong kind of stimulation before birth can actually be a stressor for the infant or at that point fetus. And they suggest that the fetus gets what it needs without any special stimulation. So question, how can scientists, psychological scientists, conduct research with nonverbal infants? Well, one of the earlier experimenters, Robert France, he kind of designed what they call the looking chamber, so to speak, to be able to measure how long infants stared at a stimuli. So the research using the apparatus would indicate that infants preferred complex rather than simple patterns and pictures of faces rather than non-faces. Other researchers have been able to use newborns' heart rates as well as the innate abilities that they may possess, such as the sucking reflex, to be able to study learning and their perceptual development. So, in order to study the sense of smell, researchers have been able to measure changes in the newborn's heart rates when they were presented with different types of odors. Now, as we approach adolescence, the clearest and most dramatic physical sign of change is puberty. And that's that growth spurt that'll occur, okay? And it's going to be characterized by these rapid increases in one's height, one's weight, as well as their skeletal growth. And there'll be significant changes in the reproductive structures and sexual characteristics. Maturation and hormone secretion will cause rapid development of female ovaries and uterus, the vagina, as well as the onset of a menstruation or a monarch. And this will happen in an adolescent female, and it can range between appropriate ages of, it can start around, I'll even say earlier than 12. I'll say some have demonstrated and shown it at ages of 10 and up. It again is on an individual basis. So in the adolescent male, growth hormone is going to start helping with the testes, the scrotum, as well as the penis development. The male will start experiencing their first ejaculation, which is a sperm mark. Okay? The testes and the ovaries in turn will start to produce hormones that will lead to the development of a secondary sex characteristic, that being the growth of pubic hair, the deepening of a voice, the growth of facial hair in men, and the growth of breasts in women. So during an adolescent growth spurt, and you have to note that there's going to be gender differences within height that's gained during puberty. So girls on average are going to be about 2 years ahead of boys in their growth spurt, and are therefore going to be taller than most boys between the ages of 10 and 14 approximately. However, as we know, it can change throughout that time, and the older they get and get closer to adulthood, you'll start seeing that change will occur, where boys will then start catching up. All right, so speaking more about secondary characteristics. Complex physical changes in puberty primarily happens because of the hormones being secreted from the ovaries and testes. And that's also involving the pituitary gland in the brain, as well as the adrenal glands near our kidneys. They all work in hand to help one develop. Now, it's time to start talking about middle-age physical development. Okay, as we know, that range can be from 40s and up near 60s. So for women, one of the things that they have to deal with is what we call menopause, and that's the cessation of the menstrual cycle. And again, this can happen anywhere between the ages of 45 to 55. Now understand that this is going to be the second most important life milestone in physical development for the female. The decreased production of estrogen, which is dominant in the female hormone, produces certain physical changes, okay? However, popular belief that menopause, or what others call the change of life, causes serious psychological mood swings or loss of sexual interest, and depression, really hasn't been able to be supported by research. But you'll have others say otherwise. Remember my statement. My disclaimer is nothing is ever 100% when we're speaking on this. You will have some outliers who can say differently. Okay? In fact, most studies that find that postmenopausal women, they can report that the relief is, some of them have said their libido has increased, as well as having positive reactions of being at the end of their menstrual cycle. Some make it a party, not having to worry about that stuff month to month anymore. Now, when psychological problems do arise, though, you'll have some that'll reflect that they'll feel devalued because they're becoming older, and that most of the physiological process of menopause makes that devaluation even more profound. So, given that in our society, the U.S. is considered Western society, women are going to be highly valued for their youth as well as their beauty, and the biological process, such as aging, actually can be difficult for some women. Culturally speaking, women in cultures that derogate aging tend to kind of experience more anxiety. They might be more depressed at the start and during the course of menopause. There's going to be physical changes such as unexpected weight gain. There'll be a decline within sexual responsiveness. There may be loss of muscle strength. Hair's going to start to gray. That might lead, and it may leave some men, women as well, to feel kind of depressed to talk about these losses and as their life progresses. They often see these alterations as a biological signal of aging, and then there's going to be the thoughts about our mortality. We're coming toward the end of our journey, so to speak. So such physical and psychological changes in men are called male climactic. Now we're going to talk about late adulthood and the physical development there. So after middle age, most of those physical changes in development are going to be more gradual and occur in our heart and our arteries and the sensory receptors. So one example of that might be our cardiac output, which is that volume of blood that will be pumped by the heart each minute. It starts to decrease, whereas blood pressure will start to increase due to that thickening and stiffening of our arterial walls. Our eyesight, visual acuity, as well as our depth perception starts to decline. Hearing acuity, it lessens, especially for high frequency sounds. And of course, smell sensitivity will begin to decrease. And then what about memory issues? Those are, what if it's been inherited genetic, uh, those that might have those genetic predispositions for Alzheimer's disease, as well as other serious diseases that come along with old age. The public and most researchers have long thought that aging is accompanied by a widespread death of neurons in the brain. And although this decline does happen with degenerative disorders like Alzheimer's, this is no longer really believed to be part of a normal aging process. So it's also important that we remember that age-related memory problems are not on a continuum with Alzheimer's disease. Not everybody is going to have that issue. That is, normal forgetfulness really doesn't mean that serious dementia is going to occur. Aging does seem to take its toll, though, on the speed of how fast we think, that information processing. Decreased speeds of processing might reflect with problems with our encoding things, and that means taking information into long-term storage and then being able to retrieve it again, getting that information out of storage. So if memory is like a filing system, older people might have to take a little more time going through their file cabinets, and it might be where it takes them longer to initially file the information and then later retrieve that information. So although mental speed declines with age, general information processing as well as memory ability is actually largely unaffected. So now we're going to get a little deep. Here's a question for you. What causes us to age and then die? If we set aside the contributions from secondary aging, and I'm talking about changes that results from disease, misuse, neglect, then what happens is we're left with to consider primary aging. And that's that gradual, inevitable aging that's related to physical and mental changes and processes. So there's two main theories that helps to explain primary aging and death. One being program theory and the second one damage theory. So according to program theory, aging is genetically controlled. Once the ovums fertilize, the program for aging and death is set and starts to run. There was a researcher, Leonard Hayflick, back in 1977, and then he worked on it some more in 1996. But he felt that human cells seems to have a built-in lifespan. He observed that after doubling about 50 times in the laboratory, that culture cells, they kind of ceased to divide. They just reached what we now call the Hayflick limit. The other explanation for primary aging is called damage theory. Now, this is when an accumulation of damage to our cells and our organs over years ultimately will cause our death. So now let's start looking at a little something more uplifting, like our cognitive development. So Piaget's theory, that's where we're going to start. Okay. Assimilation and accommodation, these are two major processes by which schemas, they grow and change over time. So with assimilation, this is when we're trying to apply our existing schemas to be able to formulate new information. And that new information will be then incorporated, assimilated within our existing schemas. So as the slide suggests, a schema is basically a basic unit of our intellect, and it's built of cognitive structures as well as patterns that consist of numbered organized ideas that helps to grow and differentiate as we experience more things. So as we take in new information, we start to adjust our schemas, and this is what the process of accommodation is. So just remember, assimilation is that process of absorbing the new information into existing schemas. So an example being, infants use their sucking schema not only in sucking nipples, but they also use it in sucking their blankets, their fingers, and then there's accommodation. And again, this is taking in that new information or stimuli that cannot be assimilated per se and into the new schemas, and instead they're developed, or the old schemas will change to better fit the new information. So an example being here would be that an infant's first attempt to eat solid food with a spoon, that's pretty much going to show you what accommodation's like. Initially, it'll be on the side of their face, they'll have the back of the spoon instead of the front, but eventually they'll realize and be able to adjust it so that it fit neatly into their mouth. Now, in Piaget's theory, there's 4 stages of cognitive development that I want you to make sure that y'all know, okay? So more or less, let's start talking about the sensory motor stage. Now, during the sensory motor stage, this lasts from approximately birth until language acquisition is acquired. And then when I say acquired, I'm talking about a good amount of it, and that's usually around age 2. Here, children will be exploring the world and starting to develop those schemas, primarily through their senses as well as their motor activities, hence the term sensory motor. Now, one important concept that you want to keep in mind is that infants will acquire during the sensory motor stage is what we call object permanence. Okay? Now, when we're talking about the next stage, we move on to talking about pre-operational stage. And this is going to be roughly between the ages of 2 to 7 years old. Here, language starts to advance even more so, and the child will start to think symbolically. Basically, what they do is they start using symbols such as words to help represent concepts. Three other different qualities will characterize these problems or limits during this stage. First one being a lack of operations. And Piaget calls this that pre-operational because the child will lack the ability to have those operations. They won't be able to do reversible mental processes. So an example being a little boy that's in the pre-operational stage, they may have a brother and you ask them, do you have a brother? Now he'll say yes. But if you turn around and ask him if his brother have a brother, the likelihood is that it's not wired yet for him, so he'll say no. So to understand that his brother has a brother, he got to first be able to reverse that role or that concept. That, yes, I have a brother, so that means he has to have a brother. Excuse me. So the second thing is egocentrism. Now, in this particular stage, children have difficulty understanding that there are points of view other than their own, and that's known as egocentrism. During the preschooler, they'll move in front of you to get to their better view of the TV, or they'll repeatedly ask questions while you might be on the phone because this is about them, not about you, okay? At this stage, children will assume that others see, hear, feel, think, and be for what they need. The egocentric pre-operational child is going to fail to understand that a phone caller cannot see they're nodding their head. So when they're talking, you might be talking to the child, and meanwhile you're saying, are you still there? Okay. Pretty much pre-operational children's egocentrism also sometimes can lead to them believing that, bad thoughts has caused their siblings or their parents or caregivers to get sick, or if they say, oh, I hate you, please die, and God forbid something happens, they'll feel that they're at fault, okay? Or they'll see that their misbehavior could have caused these problems, as far as like if the parents are not doing well with one another. They might think because they were bad that their parents divorced. So because they think the world centers on them, and they often can't separate reality from what's going on inside their own heads. Now the next one would be animism, and that's believing that objects such as the sun, the trees, and clouds, feelings and intentions like dark clouds are angry, or soap sinks to the bottom of the tub because it's sleepy and tired. Animism is referring to that belief that all things are living or that they're all animated. All right, so let's move on, and we're getting into the concrete stages. And within the concrete stage, now you're going to see this is going through ages of 7 to 11. Now we're going to see that there's more development within the child. They're able to perform more operation and thinking. They're starting to be able to connect things, okay? But concretely, they're able to take on conservation, and this is when they're seeing how changes within shape and appearance can actually be reversed. So now, during this stage, if you ask that same little boy, do you have a brother? And they say yes. And then you ask, well, do your brother have a brother? They will turn around and say, why, yes, me. Okay? So at this point, they're not thinking about themselves, egocentric any longer. That's starting to alleviate. They're starting to think about others. And then they start to put two and two together analytically. They're starting to have a little bit more reasoning and understanding that clouds are not angry when they're dark. They're just dark because it's looking like it's about to rain. They're able to take on better explanations and have a better understanding. So even though they're taking on this information, you do have to realize that abstractly is still, they're not able to think abstractly, or they're not able to give you a hypothetical hypothesis, so to speak. Um, when I say concrete, it is basically they could deal with objects and different events to a certain extent, but not as broad as an adult will. Now, in the formal stage, which is the fourth stage, this is when you're moving toward adolescence, for ages 11 and up. Okay, now the ability to think abstractly and thinking of others, this is all starting to come into play. During this stage, they may still demonstrate problems in terms of personal fables and having imaginary friends and audiences, and really being connected and thinking it's about what they see and not rather what the world sees. They're still getting those kinks out, so to speak. But overall, the abstract thinking develops more, and altruism and ability to think of others starts to come into play during this time. They also start realizing about their bodies, and they start understanding the changes that they're going through. All right. So now, just as important as Piaget's work has been in terms of speaking about development, we also have Vygotsky, okay? And their work has been done in comparison and looking at controversy throughout. So as influential as Piaget has been in terms of cognitive development, we have to also take into account Lev Vygotsky, who's a Russian psychologist, and pretty much what he looked at is the socio-cultural influences on a child's cognitive development, rather than those internal schemas that Piaget emphasizes. So according to Vygotsky, children basically is going to construct their knowledge from their culture, from the language learned, as well as collaborate with social interactions, as well as experiences. Okay? Vygotsky felt that adults are extremely important in terms of teaching development. And that's meaning that the instruction is particularly helpful when it falls within the child's zone of proximal development. And if you're taking notes, I want you to write this down. Zone of proximal development. And more or less, here is this being of the child needs not only to experience things, but they need the guide of someone who's in an expert role, so to speak, who've already gone through these experiences to be able to guide them to learn through those experiences. Okay? So now that I've talked a little bit about Vygotsky's theory, I want you to consider two major criticisms of Piaget's work. One being the underestimated abilities as well as underestimated genetic and cultural influences that are involved with development. There's been research that demonstrated Piaget might have underestimated young children's cognitive development. Okay, an example being that there's evidence that very young infants would have basic concepts of how objects are moved, and they're kind of more aware about objects continuing to exist even when it's not within full view, and they're able to recognize speech sounds. Piaget's model, like other stage models, it also has been criticized for not really talking or taking into account the genetic and cultural differences. So take a moment, take a look here, and I want you to review and see if some of this information has melded and locked between the lecture as well as your readings. Please make sure you're keeping up with your readings. But take a minute and see if you can answer these questions. You'll pause the video, and then once you've answered, please do move on. Which, by the way, we're at the end of a chapter already, just that quick. What you'll be doing from here on out for the rest of the week is you will be getting to do your assignments, okay? And it's going to be a little thicker than most. I will be making sure that you'll be having exercises that you'll have to complete by Friday, okay? You have to make sure Friday, 11:59, that the work is done. On that note, if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, please feel free to get with me in the inbox. If it's where you need to have a chat, please inbox me and see, and I'll be happy to set up a chat or a conference with you so that we can communicate more effectively, since now we are totally online. But on that note, I will be checking daily my emails and my messages, and I want y'all to have a great week. Please remember to stay safe. Please remember to follow the advice in terms of COVID-19 of the CDC or World Health Organization. Wash those hands continuously, 20 seconds. Try not to touch your face if at all possible. Also, social distancing. It's extremely important. You want to keep yourself at least 6 feet away from people. That way the germs, if a person is infected, the likelihood is lessened the further apart you are. On that note, I will be sending out notice for the next week, probably on Friday, to get you prepared and ready for the next week of work. Have a great and safe week, everybody.